Some babies cry for milk, some cry for warmth. But the Hayes heir cried as if the world itself had forgotten him. From the moment Noah Hayes entered the world, the sound never stopped. Nurses said it was normal at first. Newborns cried. That was what they did. But hours turned into days, and days stretched into nearly 2 weeks, and the crying never faded into the quiet breathing of sleep. It echoed through the private wing of St. Gabriel Medical Center like a question no one could answer. Specialists came from 3 different states. Pediatricians, neonatal experts, even a behavioral consultant flown in from Chicago. They checked Noah's heartbeat, his oxygen levels, his temperature, his reflexes. Every test came back perfect. Perfect health, perfect lungs, perfect brain activity. Yet the crying continued, thin and desperate, rising and falling without rest. The only person who didn't show panic was Alexander Hayes. At 6'2", dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than the average monthly rent in Manhattan, he stood beside the hospital bassinet like a statue carved from patience and exhaustion. Alexander Hayes was known in every financial magazine in America as the youngest billionaire CEO on the West Coast, a man who built a technology empire before turning 30. Investors described him as controlled, strategic, impossible to read. But even the most powerful alpha in the room could not silence the cries of his own son. The nurses had tried everything. Swaddling, gentle rocking, soft music, temperature adjustments, a special imported bassinet designed to mimic the rhythm of a heartbeat. Nothing worked. The crying only grew hoarse and tired, as if Noah himself wished he could stop, but didn't know how. By the 12th night, even the experienced staff looked defeated. One nurse rubbed her temples after a 16-hour shift. Another quietly admitted she had never seen anything like it. The hospital director finally made a call to the neonatal support registry, asking if any specialists were available who might help with unusual bonding responses in infants. That was how Ethan Carter's name appeared on the screen. Ethan wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. In fact, his employee file described him in the simplest terms possible. Omega registered nurse, pediatric care assistant, age 26. He worked long night shifts at St. Gabriel's because fewer people asked questions during the quiet hours. He rented a small apartment barely 15 minutes away and usually arrived at work carrying a paper cup of gas station coffee and a calm expression that made anxious parents feel safe. When Ethan stepped into the hospital room that night, the crying filled the air immediately, sharp and relentless. The nurses barely noticed him at first. They were too busy adjusting monitors and whispering frustrated suggestions. But Ethan noticed something else. The baby's small fists were trembling with exhaustion, his face red from hours of crying, and his tiny chest rose and fell in quick, uneven breaths. Ethan moved closer without thinking. "Hey there," he murmured softly, his voice barely louder than a whisper. The moment he reached the bassinet and gently lifted Noah into his arms, something impossible happened. The crying stopped. Not slowly, not gradually. It simply stopped, as if someone had turned off a switch that had been stuck since the day Noah was born. The room fell into stunned silence. Across the room, Alexander Hayes finally looked up. For several long seconds, no one in the room moved. The sudden silence felt almost unreal after nearly 2 weeks of constant crying. Ethan Carter stood beside the bassinet with the small infant cradled gently in his arms, instinctively adjusting his hold so the baby's head rested comfortably against his chest. Noah Hayes was still breathing quickly, the soft hiccups of a child who had cried far too long, but the desperate sound that had filled the hospital wing was gone. One of the nurses blinked in disbelief. Another glanced down at the monitoring tablet, as if expecting alarms to appear. Nothing changed. The baby's heartbeat was steady. Oxygen levels were perfect. The only difference was the calm expression slowly settling over the tiny face that had not known rest since birth. Ethan rocked slightly from side to side, without even realizing he was doing it. Years of working with newborns had trained his body to respond automatically, gentle movements that helped fragile bodies relax. "It is okay," he murmured quietly, the words soft and warm, the kind of voice that carried reassurance without effort. Noah made a small sound that was closer to a sigh than a cry, and curled his fingers into the fabric of Ethan's scrub shirt. Across the room, Alexander Hayes stared at them with a focus so intense that it seemed to change the air itself. The Alpha had watched medical experts fail one after another, had listened to explanations that sounded more like guesses than answers. Yet the moment this quiet Omega nurse had lifted his son, The chaos had simply stopped. Alexander stepped closer, his polished shoes silent against the hospital floor. Up close, he could see the exhaustion on the baby's tiny face and something else that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. Comfort. Noah looked comfortable for the first time since the day he had been born. "What did you do?" Alexander asked, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a man used to having answers. Ethan glanced up, slightly startled as if he had forgotten anyone else was in the room. "I did not do anything special," he replied honestly. "I just picked him up." The nurses exchanged uncertain looks. One of them spoke quietly. "We tried holding him earlier. Several times." Ethan nodded slowly, studying the baby with gentle concern. Noah had stopped trembling now, though his small hands remained curled into Ethan's shirt as if letting go might bring the crying back. Ethan adjusted his arm again, instinctively supporting the baby's back. Sometimes newborns respond to scent and warmth more than anything else, he explained carefully. It helps them feel safe. Alexander watched every movement. His son, who had screamed through endless hours of expert care, now rested quietly against the chest of a stranger who spoke in calm, steady tones. Noah's breathing gradually slowed until it matched the peaceful rhythm of sleep. A few minutes passed, then 10. No crying returned. The nurses began whispering to one another in disbelief, but Ethan barely noticed. His attention stayed on the baby, gently patting the tiny back as Noah drifted deeper into rest. Finally, Alexander spoke again, his voice lower now. "How long have you worked with newborns?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "About 5 years." The alpha nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the peaceful child in Ethan's arms. For the first time since Noah had entered the world, the room felt quiet. Not tense quiet, not worried quiet, just quiet. And in that silence, Alexander Hayes realized something that none of the doctors had been able to explain. His son was not just calm. His son was finally at peace. The quiet in the hospital room lasted longer than anyone expected. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and still. Noah Hayes remained asleep in Ethan Carter's arms, his small chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths that every exhausted nurse in the room watched with disbelief. The baby who had cried almost nonstop for nearly 2 weeks was finally resting. One of the nurses quietly stepped closer, glancing at the infant monitor again as if confirming that nothing unusual had triggered the calm. Everything remained normal. Heart rate stable. Oxygen steady. Temperature perfect. Yet the most important change could not be measured by any machine. Noah was peaceful. Ethan barely noticed the attention around him. His focus remained on the tiny child curled gently against him, the warmth of the baby's small body settling naturally against his chest. Years of working with infants had taught him how fragile newborn comfort could be. Sudden noises or unfamiliar movements could easily wake them. So he stayed still, rocking slowly with quiet patience. After nearly 20 minutes, Noah stirred slightly. His tiny fingers shifted, gripping the fabric of Ethan's shirt more firmly, as if he was searching for something familiar. Ethan looked down instinctively. "Hey there, little guy," he murmured softly. The baby's eyes opened halfway, cloudy with sleep. For a brief moment, Noah looked confused, as if trying to understand why the world suddenly felt calmer than it had since the day he was born. Then his tiny face turned slightly toward Ethan's chest, and his mouth made a small searching motion that made the nearest nurse freeze in surprise. "Is he hungry?" she whispered. Another nurse frowned thoughtfully. "He was fed less than an hour ago." Ethan felt the small movement again. Noah pressed his cheek closer against him, making quiet, restless sounds that were not cries, but something softer, something instinctive. Ethan's expression changed slightly as realization crossed his face. Infants sometimes reacted strongly to warmth, scent, and the comfort of a caregiver's body. For many newborns, that instinct helped them recognize the person who could nourish and protect them. But this situation was unusual. Noah was not simply calm. He seemed to be searching. The baby shifted again, his tiny hands curling against Ethan's shirt while his head tilted slightly, as if following a scent he could not fully understand yet. Ethan gently adjusted his hold so the infant would stay comfortable. "He might just need to feel secure," Ethan explained quietly, though he was not entirely certain himself. Across the room, Alexander Hayes observed every detail with the intense focus of a man who had built his entire life around understanding patterns and solving problems. Something about this moment was impossible to ignore. His son had rejected every attempt at comfort from trained specialists. Yet the moment this Omega nurse had touched him, Noah had found peace. Now the infant seemed to react to Ethan in ways that were deeper than simple calm. Noah pressed closer again, making a soft, impatient sound that made one of the nurses whisper nervously. Ethan gently brushed a finger across the baby's back, trying to soothe the small, restless movements. "It is okay," he murmured again, his voice warm and steady. The baby relaxed slightly, but he did not fully settle. Instead, Noah turned his head again, instinctively seeking warmth and comfort from the place where he had found it moments earlier. Alexander stepped closer, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the strange interaction unfolding before him. Something about this connection felt instinctive, almost natural, in a way that none of the medical explanations had been able to provide. And as he watched his son cling quietly to Ethan Carter, the Alpha realized that the mystery surrounding Noah's endless crying might not be a medical problem at all. It might be something far more personal. The quiet searching movement continued as Noah Hayes shifted gently in Ethan Carter's arms, his small face pressing closer as if following a natural instinct that had nothing to do with the hospital room or the people watching. Ethan felt the tiny motions clearly now, the way the baby's head tilted slightly, the soft, restless sounds that newborns often made when they were seeking comfort beyond simple warmth. The nurses exchanged uncertain glances again, their professional training struggling to explain what they were seeing. One of them stepped forward quietly. "Maybe he is still hungry," she said softly, though her voice carried more uncertainty than confidence. "He was fed earlier, but newborn schedules are not always predictable." Ethan considered that possibility for a moment. He had seen infants behave this way before, small instinctive movements guided by the need for nourishment and security. But something about Noah's reaction felt deeper, almost as if the baby recognized a source of comfort that went beyond routine feeding. Noah shifted again, pressing closer while his tiny fingers tightened against Ethan's shirt. The movement was gentle but persistent, a quiet determination that made Ethan realize the infant would not fully relax until his instinctive need was answered. Ethan looked up briefly, meeting the watchful gaze of Alexander Hayes across the room. The Alpha had not spoken for several minutes, but his attention had never left them. "He might still need comfort," Ethan said carefully, choosing his words with respect. "Sometimes newborns respond strongly to natural contact and warmth. It helps regulate their breathing and stress." Alexander studied the scene silently, weighing every detail with the calm calculation that had built his reputation as one of the most successful executives in the country. Yet this moment was different from the business negotiations he usually faced. This was his son, the child who had cried endlessly since birth, finally showing signs of peace in the arms of someone who had only entered the room a short time ago. Ethan shifted slightly in the chair beside the bassinet, adjusting Noah so the baby remained secure and calm. The small searching movements continued, though they were quiet and gentle rather than distressed. Ethan's instincts told him the infant needed more than simple rocking. Newborns relied on natural nourishment and the presence of a caregiver's warmth to feel safe during their earliest days of life. Ethan hesitated for a moment, aware that the decision he was considering was unusual but not unheard of in certain medical circumstances when infants required immediate comfort and nourishment. He spoke calmly, keeping his voice respectful and steady. "If it is all right with you, I can try helping him settle more completely," he said. "Sometimes infants respond to natural feeding and closeness. It can calm their nervous system." The nurses glanced at Alexander Hayes immediately, understanding that the decision rested entirely with the child's father. The Alpha remained silent for several seconds, his sharp eyes moving between Ethan and the small infant resting against his chest. Finally, he gave a slow nod, his voice low but certain. "Do whatever will help him rest." Ethan acknowledged the permission with a small nod of gratitude. Carefully and respectfully, he adjusted his position so Noah could feel secure and comfortable. The infant responded almost immediately. The small restless sounds faded as Noah relaxed further, his tiny body settling into a calm rhythm that none of the specialists had been able to achieve before. The change was subtle but undeniable. The tension that had lingered in the room for days seemed to dissolve as the baby finally experienced the peaceful comfort he had been seeking since the moment he entered the world. And as the quiet minutes passed, Even the experienced nurses watching nearby realized they were witnessing something none of them had expected. For the first time since Noah Hayes had been born, the child was not only silent. He was truly content. The room remained calm as the quiet minutes stretched into nearly half an hour, something that none of the hospital staff had witnessed since Noah Hayes had been born. The small infant rested peacefully against Ethan Carter, his tiny hands relaxed now instead of gripping anxiously at fabric, his breathing slow and even as if he had finally discovered the comfort he had been searching for since his first moment in the world. Ethan remained seated beside the bassinet, careful not to move too suddenly. Years of experience with newborns had taught him that the first moments of calm after prolonged distress were delicate. Sudden sounds or changes could easily disrupt the fragile peace. But Noah did not wake. Instead, the baby continued resting quietly, his small face softened by the deep sleep that had eluded him for nearly 2 weeks. The nurses watching nearby exchanged amazed looks. One of them whispered under her breath that she had never seen a case like this in her entire career. Another quietly recorded the baby's stable readings on the monitoring tablet, though even the most advanced equipment could not explain what they were witnessing. Across the room, Alexander Hayes remained standing with his arms loosely folded, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the scene before him. The Alpha had built a reputation for solving problems that other executives considered impossible, yet this moment was different. For days he had watched experts attempt every medical solution available. Specialists had examined his son with cutting-edge technology, offering careful theories and cautious optimism. None of it had helped. But the moment Ethan Carter had entered the room, something had changed. It was not simply that Noah had stopped crying. The baby now seemed calmer, more settled, as if the anxiety that had troubled him since birth had quietly dissolved. Alexander stepped closer again, stopping beside the chair where Ethan sat. Up close he could see the gentle focus in the Omega nurse's expression. Ethan was not behaving like someone who had just solved a medical mystery. He simply looked patient and attentive, focused entirely on the comfort of the child resting in his arms. "How is he?" Alexander asked quietly. Ethan glanced down at the sleeping infant before answering. "He is doing very well right now," he said softly. "His breathing is steady and his body has relaxed completely. That usually means the baby finally feels safe enough to rest." Alexander considered those words carefully. Safe. The concept lingered in his mind longer than he expected. His son had been surrounded by skilled professionals, expensive medical equipment, and the most comfortable private hospital environment money could provide. Yet none of that had given Noah the sense of security he needed. Instead, it had appeared in the presence of one quiet Omega nurse who had simply lifted the child into his arms. Another nurse approached slowly, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. She studied the infant's peaceful expression with obvious relief. "He has not slept like this since he was born," she said quietly. Ethan nodded slightly. "Sometimes newborns just need the right connection," he explained. "They are very sensitive to the environment around them. Warmth, scent, calm voices. Those things help regulate their emotions more than people realize." Alexander listened to every word. The more he observed Ethan, the more one realization began forming clearly in his mind. This calm was not temporary. His instincts told him that the connection between the Omega nurse and his son was genuine. And as the Alpha looked down at the peaceful child resting against Ethan Carter, he made a silent decision that would change all of their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. The hospital room remained peaceful long after Noah Hayes had fallen asleep, a calm that felt almost fragile after the long days of constant crying that had filled the neonatal wing. Ethan Carter continued holding the small infant carefully, maintaining the steady warmth and quiet rhythm that had allowed the baby to relax for the first time since birth. Nearly 40 minutes passed before Noah stirred again. His tiny fingers moved slightly against Ethan's shirt, and a small sleepy sound escaped his lips. Ethan instinctively adjusted his hold, gently supporting the baby's head while whispering soft, reassuring words. The infant blinked slowly as his eyes opened, but instead of crying as he had done countless times before, he simply looked around with quiet curiosity. The difference was so dramatic that one of the nurses quietly placed a hand over her mouth in surprise. "He woke up without crying," she whispered. It was a simple observation, yet in this room it felt extraordinary. Noah shifted slightly again, stretching his tiny arms before settling comfortably against Ethan's chest. The restless tension that had defined his first days of life seemed to have faded entirely. Alexander Hayes watched every movement with careful attention. He had spent years analyzing complex business negotiations and identifying subtle signals that others often missed. Now those same instincts were focused entirely on the connection forming between his son and the Omega nurse sitting quietly beside the bassinet. "May I?" Alexander asked after a moment, gesturing gently toward his son. Ethan nodded immediately and slowly stood so the alpha could take the baby. With practiced care, Ethan transferred Noah into his father's arms. For a brief moment, the infant remained calm, his eyes half open as he studied the unfamiliar position. Then his tiny face tightened slightly, and a small uncertain sound escaped his lips. The sound was not the desperate crying that had once filled the hospital room, but it carried enough unease to make the nearby nurses tense. Noah shifted again, turning his head instinctively, as if searching for something he could not immediately find. Within seconds his expression began to crumple into the early signs of distress. Ethan stepped closer without hesitation. "It is okay," he said softly, placing a gentle hand on the baby's back. The reaction was immediate. Noah relaxed again the moment he sensed Ethan's presence beside him. The tension faded from his tiny body, replaced by the quiet comfort that had defined the earlier moments of peace. Alexander looked down at his son thoughtfully before glancing back at Ethan. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Noah was calm when Ethan was near and unsettled when he was not. It was not a coincidence. One of the nurses cleared her throat carefully before speaking. "Sometimes newborns form strong early attachment responses," she explained cautiously, "especially if they associate someone with safety and nourishment." Alexander nodded slowly. His mind had already reached a conclusion far more decisive than the careful explanations offered by the medical staff. He looked directly at Ethan Carter, his voice calm but firm with the authority that had built his entire career. "It seems my son is not ready to be away from you." Ethan blinked slightly in surprise, clearly unsure how to respond to such a statement. Alexander continued without hesitation. "Until we understand why this connection exists, I would like you to remain involved in his care." The nurses exchanged curious glances, realizing that the quiet Omega nurse who had simply come in for a routine shift had suddenly become the most important person in the room. Ethan looked down at the peaceful baby again, then back at the alpha standing beside him. He had come to work expecting another ordinary night at the hospital. Instead, he now stood at the center of a situation none of them fully understood. And as Noah Hayes rested quietly between them, the bond forming in that quiet hospital room began shaping a future that neither Ethan nor Alexander could yet predict. Morning sunlight slowly filled the hospital room through the wide glass windows, casting a soft golden glow across the quiet space, where Noah Hayes rested peacefully in Ethan Carter's arms. The night shift had nearly ended, yet no one had suggested moving the baby away from the Omega nurse, who had finally brought calm to the restless newborn. For the first time since Noah's birth, the medical monitors showed long stretches of stable readings instead of constant stress signals. The nurses who had worked through the long night whispered to one another about the remarkable change, occasionally glancing toward Ethan with expressions of amazement and relief. Ethan himself remained quiet and focused, gently rocking Noah as the baby slept again after another brief feeding and moment of wakefulness. The infant's tiny hand rested against Ethan's chest, his small fingers occasionally curling as if he wanted to make sure the warmth and comfort nearby would not disappear. Alexander Hayes had not left the room since the moment his son had finally fallen silent. The powerful alpha stood near the window now, watching the peaceful scene with thoughtful eyes that revealed far more emotion than the business world ever saw from him. In the early light of morning, the tension that had surrounded the newborn's first days seemed distant, almost unreal. After several minutes, Alexander stepped closer. Again, his attention returning to Ethan and the baby. "How long is your shift supposed to last?" he asked quietly. Ethan glanced at the wall clock before answering. "Another hour," he said. "Then the morning staff usually takes over." Alexander considered that answer carefully. The idea of handing Noah back to routine hospital care no longer felt acceptable. The pattern from the previous hours had become unmistakable. His son was calm when Ethan was present and unsettled when he was not. Allowing that connection to disappear felt like risking the fragile peace Noah had finally discovered. "When your shift ends," Alexander said slowly, "I would like you to stay." Ethan blinked slightly, surprised by the request. "Stay," he repeated softly. Alexander nodded once. As part of Noah's care, the nearby nurses looked up immediately, sensing the importance of the conversation. Ethan hesitated for a moment, clearly uncertain how to respond. I am just a pediatric nurse, he said carefully. There are specialists who are more qualified to handle complicated cases. Alexander's expression remained calm but certain. Those specialists have already tried, he replied. You are the one person my son has responded to. Ethan looked down at the sleeping baby again. Noah's breathing remained slow and peaceful, his tiny body relaxed against the warmth he had chosen. The connection between them was impossible to deny. Ethan had felt at the moment he first lifted the infant from the bassinet. Still, he spoke honestly. I do not understand why he reacts this way with me, he admitted. Alexander gave a quiet nod. Neither do I. The alpha's voice remained steady, but there was something thoughtful behind the words. That is exactly why I want you to remain close to him until we find the answer. Another nurse stepped forward gently. Mr. Hayes, she said respectfully, if the baby continues responding positively, extended contact with Ethan could actually support his emotional regulation during these early weeks. Alexander nodded slightly in acknowledgement, though his decision had already been made long before the medical explanation arrived. He looked back at Ethan with quiet certainty. You helped my son find peace when no one else could, he said. Until we understand why, I would like you to stay with us. Ethan remained silent for a moment, feeling the small, steady weight of the newborn resting peacefully in his arms. The night had begun as an ordinary hospital shift, yet now it seemed to be leading him somewhere entirely unexpected. And as Noah Hayes slept quietly between them, both Ethan and Alexander sensed that the strange connection forming around the tiny child was only the beginning of a story that would change all of their lives. By mid-morning, the hospital wing had quietly adjusted around a reality no one had expected the night before. The staff who came in for the day shift quickly heard the unusual update during the morning briefing. The newborn who had cried without stopping since birth was finally calm, and the change had started the moment one particular nurse had lifted him into his arms. Inside the private recovery room, Ethan Carter remained seated in the same comfortable chair beside the bassinet, though by now it felt less like a temporary assignment and more like a quiet responsibility that had somehow chosen him. Noah Hayes woke slowly as the sunlight brightened across the room. His small eyes blinked open with the sleepy curiosity of a newborn still learning about the world. For a moment he simply looked around, his gaze unfocused but calm, as if he was measuring the quiet atmosphere around him. Then he turned instinctively toward Ethan, the same natural motion that had appeared several times during the night. Ethan noticed the movement immediately and smiled gently. Good morning, little one, he said softly. Noah responded with a small content sound, something closer to a hum than a cry. The nurses who had just entered the room paused in the doorway, watching the peaceful interaction with fascination. Only 2 days earlier, the sound of this baby crying had echoed through the entire neonatal wing. Now the infant appeared relaxed and curious, his tiny hands stretching lazily in the warm air before settling again against Ethan's chest. Alexander Hayes entered the room a moment later after finishing a quiet phone call in the hallway. Even after only a few hours of rest, he looked more relaxed than he had at any point since his son's birth. His attention moved immediately to the baby. How is he this morning? Alexander asked. Ethan glanced down at Noah before answering. He woke up calm, he said. That is usually a very good sign for newborns who were previously distressed. Alexander nodded slowly, watching as Noah continued studying Ethan's face with a quiet focus of an infant who had already decided where he felt safest. The alpha stepped closer to the chair and rested one hand lightly on the back of it. The doctors will want to run additional observations today, he said. They want to understand why his behavior changed so suddenly. Ethan gave a small thoughtful nod. That makes sense, he replied. Newborn attachment responses can sometimes appear unexpectedly, especially when the baby recognizes a source of comfort. Alexander considered that explanation, but something about the connection still felt deeper than simple comfort. Noah's reactions were too immediate and too consistent to ignore. Every time Ethan moved farther away, even briefly, the baby became restless. The moment Ethan returned, the calm returned as well. One of the pediatric specialists entered the room carrying a tablet filled with updated monitoring results. She reviewed the information quietly before looking at Ethan and Alexander with clear curiosity. All of his vitals are excellent, she explained. Stress markers are down significantly compared to the last 48 hours. She paused before adding thoughtfully, the only consistent change in his environment has been prolonged contact with Ethan. Alexander's gaze shifted briefly toward Ethan again. The conclusion was becoming obvious to everyone involved. Noah Hayes had finally found something he needed, and that connection centered entirely around the quiet Omega nurse who had come to work expecting a normal shift. Ethan gently rocked the baby once more as Noah settled comfortably against him again, his breathing calm and steady. None of them spoke for several seconds as the peaceful moment filled the room. And as the morning sunlight continued to brighten the quiet space around them, it became clear to everyone present that whatever bond had formed between Ethan Carter and the Hayes heir was not temporary. It was something deeper, something instinctive, and it was only just beginning to reveal its meaning. Several weeks later, the Hayes residence stood quietly on a hill overlooking the early autumn skyline of Seattle, its wide glass windows reflecting the pale morning light that stretched across the city below. Inside the spacious living room, the atmosphere felt completely different from the tense hospital nights that had once surrounded Noah Hayes during his first days of life. The small infant who had once cried without rest now lay peacefully on a soft blanket spread across the couch beside Ethan Carter. Noah kicked his tiny feet happily while studying the world around him with wide, curious eyes, occasionally making small content sounds that filled the quiet room with warmth instead of distress. Ethan sat nearby with a gentle smile, keeping one hand close so the baby could hold his finger whenever he wished. Over the past several weeks, the routine had slowly become natural. After careful discussions with the hospital staff and pediatric specialists, Alexander Hayes had arranged for Ethan to remain closely involved in Noah's daily care. At first, the decision had been purely practical. Noah remained calm only when Ethan was nearby, and the peaceful stability of the baby's health was something no responsible parent would risk losing. But as the days passed, the arrangement had grown into something more comfortable than anyone expected. Ethan had gradually become part of the quiet rhythm of the Hayes household. The mornings usually began with soft sunlight filling the nursery, while Noah woke calmly instead of crying. The afternoons often included slow walks through the peaceful garden behind the house, where the baby listened quietly to the rustling leaves and distant city sounds. Even the evenings had settled into a predictable calm as Noah rested easily after feeding and gentle care. Across the room, Alexander Hayes stood near the window with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the peaceful scene with a thoughtful expression that carried none of the exhaustion that had once shadowed his face during those difficult hospital nights. His life had always been filled with demanding schedules, complex business negotiations, and constant responsibility. Yet lately he had discovered that the quiet sound of a content newborn and the calm presence of the Omega who cared for him had become the most grounding part of his day. Noah suddenly made a small excited sound and reached his arms toward Ethan again, clearly asking to be lifted. Ethan laughed softly and leaned forward, gently picking up the baby and holding him securely against his shoulder. The response was immediate. Noah relaxed completely, resting his tiny head against Ethan's chest as if the position had always been the most natural place in the world for him to be. Alexander watched the moment with quiet understanding. The doctors had eventually concluded that Noah had simply developed a powerful early comfort association with Ethan's presence. The warmth, calm voice, and steady care had created a sense of security that allowed the baby's nervous system to relax and develop normally. But Alexander suspected the explanation was only part of the truth. Some connections were more than simple circumstances. Some bonds formed because two lives had crossed paths at exactly the right moment. Ethan looked up and met Alexander's gaze across the room. Neither of them needed to say anything. The peaceful child resting quietly between them was already the answer to every question that had once troubled those long hospital nights. Noah Hayes had entered the world searching for comfort, and somehow he had found it in the one person who had simply been willing to hold him when no one else could. And in the quiet warmth of the Hayes home, the three of them had slowly begun building something that felt less like coincidence and more like the beginning of a family.